Last time, we did the fun part, tearing down the motor to the bare block. This time, we'll be inspecting the internals and deciding how far to go with the rebuild. My goal here is to have an engine that can be pushed reliably for the season. It's probably coming out next year, but I want to make sure there's nothing to worry about. That being said, I do want to do the job right, but this isn't going to be a rebuild that's supposed to last 200,000 miles. More like 500 miles. The inspection began before I pulled the motor. I did a leak down test on all cylinders to get an idea of the engine's condition. Half the cylinders only had 1 to 3% loss, but a couple of them were leaking 10%. Definitely not ideal for a race motor. I heard air coming out the front main seal as well as the dipstick tube. This is fairly normal, but it means air is getting past the piston rings. I didn't hear anything out of the intake or exhaust, which means the valves are probably fine. The very first problem that greeted me was the oil pump nut. It had partially backed itself off already, and the engine could have lost oil pressure and blown at any point. This is a known issue, so I half expected it. Once I had the engine mostly apart, I tested the axial plane and the crankshaft. This is controlled by the thrust bearing. If it's worn out, the crankshaft can move too much, especially from the clutch. I measured 0.08 of an inch. The limit is supposed to be 6. This likely means my rod bearings will be worn unevenly, but I'll check for that later. A quick visual inspection of the main bearings when removing them was good enough. They had some regular wear, but nothing concerning. The front main bearing is expected to have more wear because of the pulley in the front of the engine that gets pulled upwards by the belts. Next, I tested for a bent crankshaft by turning it with the 2 end bearings still installed. Doesn't even move. I couldn't detect the faintest movement, so we're good here. After taking the crank out, I took measurements of all the main and rod journals. Generally, the rod journals will wear mostly top to bottom because of the power stroke. I didn't see any indication of wear on the rod or main bearings. The worst I saw was some minor particulate scoring, but this can be polished up easily. With the pistons out, I took a look at the rod bearings. Some of the wear was definitely tapered, meaning it was thicker on one side than the other. This is the result of too much axial play in the crankshaft or a bent connecting rod. I'm going to assume that play in the crank was causing it. If a rod was bent, I would expect to see angled wear in the piston skirts, but they all looked normal as far as I could tell. Some of the others looked fine. It probably depends on their proximity to the thrust bearing. I checked wrist pin wear by hand. They all felt perfect. After removing the pins, they all checked out visually as well, just some varnish that made them hard to get out. I checked the rings next. The worst I saw was some discolored spots in the second rings. I don't think this is too concerning, given that the engine is under fairly low cylinder pressures and temps. Besides that, the oil rings were clogged and brittle, but nothing catastrophic. I calibrated my bore gauge to the original bore of the cylinders, which is 84 millimeters. I then took measurements at the top and bottom of every cylinder, both longitudinally and laterally. Wear laterally is expected since the connecting rod is at an angle. Since there must be a vertical force to push the rod downwards, and the rod is usually at an angle, there must also be a horizontal component of that force as well, which pushes the piston into the wall and the sides of the cylinder, resulting in wear. More wear is expected at the top of the cylinder, since that's where the cylinder pressures are the highest. Since there's more wear at the top of the cylinder, and most of that wear is in the lateral sides, this means the cylinders are both out of round as well as tapered. I measured about 0.02 of an inch of taper, and the same for out of round. I can't really find good specs for this engine, but optimal for both is less than 1/1000th. So it's not perfect, but it isn't too bad. You can also see the piston skirt measurements at the bottom. I saw the bottom of the skirts about 1/1000th thicker than the tops. This is expected since the top of the piston gets hotter and expands more than the bottom. My piston skirts aren't collapsed. Nothing worrisome here, just regular skirt coating wear. Now that I know the bores and piston sizes, I could calculate the piston to bore clearances. The maximum clearance of the most worn spots is between 5 and 6/1000ths when cold, which is the upper limit of acceptable. Moving on to the cylinder head, it took me ages to get it clean enough to get a good measurement for flatness. That's 0.05. It fits pretty easily. 0.05 is probably too much. The limit is supposed to be 2. This apparently isn't great. I may have to get the head decked. I checked my block after getting it clean and measured 0.02, also concave. Sort of fits. I was worried the straight edge wasn't straight. I did get it shipped to me after all. This was a good opportunity to check for cracks. Both the block and the cylinder head were free from any cracks I could see. Taking a closer look at the cylinder head, there was clear scoring on the exhaust cam bearings. You can clearly see that scoring and I can feel it slightly with my fingers too. The lifters had some pitting as well, which was barely feelable. The exhaust cam was badly scored in a few of the journals, which explains the scoring on the caps and tray. The intake side was in much better condition, almost no scoring. As for the valves, the exhaust side had pitting and plenty of carbon buildup. The intake valves are in much better condition and have a smaller area of contact with the seat, which is desirable. There's no visible pitting on these valves, which means they won't have to be lapped. I checked the valve guide wear next on the exhaust valves, which was the upper limit of what was acceptable, about 15 thousandths. The intake valves were slightly better at around 12. With just about everything inspected, it was time to think about how to proceed. So at this point, I need to decide how far I want to take this engine rebuild. So again, I want to reiterate, this engine rebuild isn't supposed to make sure it's going to last another 100,000 miles. It's just for making sure the engine won't blow up in the next 500. That being said, I also have the motor taken apart, so I might as well replace everything I can while I'm in here. So with that out of the way, the only thing that was really troubling was that oil pump nut. That's getting replaced with a safety wired nut so it won't back off. The other concerning thing was the exhaust camshaft. It had a bit of scoring on it, but I think I can just polish that up and get away with that as long as there's no burrs on it. The exhaust valves were in pretty bad shape and they were pitted. The right way to solve this is to get a proper valve job done. The main reason why you don't want to lap valves is because it increases the contact patch between the valve and the seat. However, these are already quite large and I think it can only help to lap them out and clean some of that carbon off. The intake valves are fine, so I see no need to do anything to those. As far as the rest of the engine, I'm already in here, so I'm going to do all those seals and gaskets, all that stuff, because why wouldn't you? It's cheap. The timing chain guides are all cracked, so those are definitely getting replaced. You actually don't have to replace the timing chains, so those are going to stay in. For the rest of the motor, rod bearings and main bearings are a must. It wouldn't be an engine rebuild if I didn't do those. I'm going to do piston rings because that's another one of those items where you really should do that while you're in there. I decided to keep the stock pistons and rods. I could bore the cylinders out and do oversized pistons, but there's a couple of reasons why I don't want to do that. First of all, it's really expensive, and second of all, it's not legal for the racing class I want to compete in. I mean, how would they know? But I'd just rather not take that risk and spend that much money. Since the pistons are just about fine, the wall clearances are kind of big. They have some skirt wear. I think it'll be okay to reuse them for the season with a new set of rings. Of course, since I'm doing a new set of rings, I'm going to want to deglaze the cylinder walls. That's easy enough. I'll just get a cylinder hone for that. The only other thing on the bottom end that's concerning are the oil squirters. So I didn't actually pay attention to these at first, but when I took apart my friend's M54 motor that he had tracked, 2 of them were broken and they had knocked around the crankcase a bit. I did see some evidence of upgraded ones being sold at one point in time, but they don't exist anymore. So for my case, I'm going to be replacing them all with OEM squirters that are new and just hope they don't break. I don't think I'm going to get the cylinder head or block leveled. Apparently they're slightly warped, but I'm not really trusting my straight edge. Not to mention it didn't have a blown head gasket and there was no evidence of overheating, so I don't think either can be that badly warped. I could do upgraded valves, springs, get a valve job done, do all the stuff. I could port the cylinder head. Again, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of time. I don't have to keep reiterating this. I just want it to run for the season. Next year I can do some of the big juicy upgrades to try and squeeze some more power out. So I think that concludes the engine inspection. As always, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe and stay tuned for the next part, which will be the engine rebuild.